Evergreen Children's Hospital had been closed for 30 years, and its legacy was a tapestry of whispered legends, most centered on the seventh floor, the old pediatric oncology ward. People said the sorrow and fear that had soaked into the walls there were so thick, they had a presence of their own, a perpetual chill, a lingering whisper of something lost. Leo didn't believe in whispers. He was a maintenance man, and the hospital was just a job. His task was to perform a final inspection of the building's electrical systems before demolition. He'd worked the last 3 nights, and so far, all he'd encountered were dust bunnies the size of cats and the ghostly creak of old pipes. He'd even found it peaceful, a welcome change from his usual noisy work. But on the 4th night, something shifted. He was on the 2nd floor, checking a breaker box, when a sound echoed down the empty corridor. It was a rhythmic, cheerful thump, 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 the sound of a bouncing rubber ball. He paused, listening. There was no one else in the building. The sound stopped. He shook his head and went back to work. A few minutes later, it started again, this time closer. He moved cautiously down the hall, peering into the dusty, abandoned rooms. In one, a faint light flickered. He pushed the door open to find a small red ball bouncing softly against the far wall, illuminated by a single, malfunctioning emergency light. He stared, frozen, as it bounced once, twice, then rolled to a stop at his feet. A high-pitched giggle seemed to emanate from the empty room, a sound so full of innocent joy that it was utterly terrifying. The incidents became more frequent and personal. He would hear his name whispered from the ventilation shafts. A music box would begin playing in a room he had just left, the tinny melody of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" echoing through the silent halls. But the most unsettling thing was the number that began to appear everywhere. The number 307. He saw it scrawled in the dust on a window, etched into the rust on a gurney, and even appearing as a temporary flicker of light on an old monitor. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't control, he ascended to the 3rd floor, a part of the building he had been told was sealed off. At the end of the long, dark corridor, he found a door with a peeling, faded sign, Room 307. The door was ajar. He pushed it open to find a small, pristine room. Unlike the rest of the hospital, it was clean. A small, neatly made bed stood in the corner, and on it, a single faded teddy bear sat propped up against a pillow. The scent of fresh disinfectant and baby powder, a stark contrast to the dust and decay, filled the air. He stepped inside. A voice, clear as a bell, spoke from behind him. "You're just like him," it said. Leo spun around. A young boy, no older than 10, stood in the doorway. He was pale and gaunt, but his eyes were bright, and a serene smile was on his face. "You came to see the happy place too?" the boy asked. Before Leo could respond, a low rumble, the sound of metal scraping against metal, echoed down the hall. The door to room 307 began to close on its own, slowly and deliberately. He lunged forward, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a final echoing clang. The boy was gone. The clean room was suddenly covered in grime and dust, the bed torn, the teddy bear rotting. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something acrid, like burnt sugar. A chorus of whispers, all speaking at once, filled the room. "Sleep now. It's quiet now. You can stay here. We'll be together." He stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs. The whispers weren't coming from the walls, but from his own mind. The hospital was trying to get inside his head to make him one of them. He fought his way to the door, pulling and kicking at the rusty metal. A child's face, pale and fleeting, pressed against the glass of the door, eyes wide with a plea he couldn't understand. "Don't let it in," the face mouthed. The whispers turned to screams, a crescendo of pure agony. He put all his weight into one final, desperate lunge. The door burst open, and he stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The screaming stopped. He looked back at room 307. The door was closed and sealed shut again. He could see a faint, childlike handprint on the grimy glass of the window, pressed from the inside. Leo ran. He ran until he was out of the hospital, into the cold night air, the screams still echoing in his ears. He never looked back. But sometimes, when he's alone at night, he hears the distant sound of a bouncing ball, and he can't help but wonder if the hospital is still calling his name. The air in Lantern Light Forest was always still, a heavy, silent blanket that muffled the sounds of the world beyond its thorny perimeter. Locals whispered tales of its twisted heart, a place where the sun never reached the ground and time itself seemed to fray. My grandfather, a man who believed in nothing but the bitter taste of good whiskey, warned me never to venture past the old iron gate. The forest remembers faces, he'd say, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. And it doesn't like new ones. I, a brash young man with a spirit too big for my small town, laughed off his warnings. It was a dare from my friends, a foolhardy contest to see who could spend a night alone in the heart of Lantern Light. They dropped me off at dusk, the setting sun painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The instant their taillights vanished, a profound silence fell, so complete it was a physical weight on my chest. I plunged into the woods, the trees immediately closing in around me, like skeletal fingers. The path I'd been told to follow, marked by a few cairns of smooth river stones, vanished almost immediately. I pushed on, the canopy above me so dense that the last vestiges of daylight were extinguished, leaving me in a darkness so profound it felt alive. My flashlight beam was a pathetic, solitary sword against the suffocating black. Hours crawled by, each minute a tiny, agonizing eternity. My breath fogged in the chilled air, and the snap of a twig under my boot sounded like a gunshot. It was then that I heard it, a sound that was not a sound at all, but a vibration in the air. A low hum, like a distant, mournful choir of bees. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a constant dizzying buzz that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stumbled upon a clearing where the trees had been cleared in a perfectly unnatural circle. In the center, a solitary, gnarled tree stood, its bark like petrified skin. Carved into the trunk were names, hundreds of them, scrawled with an eerie precision that felt less like an engraving and more like a scar. I ran my fingers over one, a name I recognized. Elias Stone, a boy who had disappeared from our town a decade ago. A chill colder than any I'd ever known shot through me. I shone my light on the next name, and the next, seeing names of people I knew, people who were still alive, people who were my friends. The humming intensified and a new sound joined it. A rustling, not of leaves, but of something dragging itself through the undergrowth. I spun around, my flashlight beam jumping wildly, but saw nothing. The dragging sound grew closer, and a new sensation prickled at my skin. The smell of something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers and wet earth. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I scrambled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard. My flashlight flew from my hand and skidded into the darkness. I lay there, breathless, listening. The dragging sound had stopped. The humming had grown deafening. Then I heard the voice. It was soft, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very trees. "He's here," it hissed. "The new face." It wasn't a human voice, but a chorus of whispers, each one a different person, speaking at once, their words a jumbled tapestry of malice. "He doesn't belong. Let's show him what we do to outsiders." The forest remembers. A hand, small and cold as an icicle, brushed against my cheek. I screamed, thrashing wildly, and scrambled to my feet. I ran blindly, a primal terror propelling me through the undergrowth, the branches whipping against my face and arms. The whispers followed, a relentless, jeering chorus. I saw a flickering light in the distance and, in a desperate burst of hope, ran toward it. It was the glow of my friends' flashlights coming back for me. I burst out of the tree line, sobbing, and they grabbed me, asking what was wrong. I looked back at the forest, but the trees were just trees. The humming was gone. The whispers were gone. My friends told me it had only been a few hours since they dropped me off, but I felt like I had aged a lifetime. I looked at their faces, faces I had just seen carved into the tree, and the terror began to creep back in. I never told them what I saw. I couldn't explain the humming, the names, the hands, but I carried the memory of the whisper with me, a ghost in my head. The forest never forgot me, and I could feel it watching, waiting for the day I would return, to claim a place among the names on that gnarled tree. The forest remembers faces, and it was waiting for mine to be carved into the wood. The house on Whisperwind Lane was a museum of forgotten things. The dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grime-streaked windows, illuminating the forgotten furniture shrouded in yellowing sheets. But the silence wasn't a peaceful one. It was a brittle, held breath kind of quiet. A silence that felt like a tight wire stretched across the throat of the old house. Leo didn't notice it at first. A young historian with a penchant for the morbidly fascinating, he had bought the old Victorian for a steal, lured by the promise of untouched archives and a history steeped in local legend. The first few weeks were a dream of dusty discoveries and architectural marvels. He spent his days cataloging a forgotten family's life through letters and journals, and his nights in the glow of a single lamp, surrounded by their ghosts on the page. Then the whispers started. Faint, like the rustle of dry leaves on pavement, they would drift from the long-dead parlor. He'd tell himself it was just the wind, a trick of the ancient pipes. But the whispers grew into a low murmur, the sound of a dozen people arguing just beyond his hearing. He started to feel a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if someone were watching him from the shadows. The air in the library would grow impossibly cold, and the pages of his books would flutter as if a frantic hand were turning them. He knew he wasn't alone. It was a poltergeist, he realized. But unlike the mischievous spirits of folklore, this one wasn't just throwing things or making noises. This one was seething with a palpable, chilling fury. Its anger wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow, burning kind of rage that permeated every room. The first physical manifestation was the rocking chair in the nursery. It had been still for decades, a silent monument to a life that never fully bloomed. But one night, Leo heard a soft creak, then another. He crept to the doorway and peered in. The chair was rocking back and forth with a slow, deliberate rhythm. There was no wind, no source of movement. The rocking grew faster, more violent, until it was slamming against the floorboards with a furious, splintering thump. The sound was not just a creak, it was a sob, a shriek of impotent rage. The poltergeist wasn't angry at Leo. He was simply a new trespasser in its long-held domain of torment. The spirit was consumed by its own rage, a hatred so profound that it warped the very fabric of the house. It was the anger of a person who had been wronged, a fury that had festered for so long it had become a living, breathing entity. One evening, as Leo was trying to decode a particularly difficult passage in a journal, the pages of every book on the shelves around him began to tremble. They fluttered, then flew off the shelves, not in a chaotic storm, but with a deliberate, directed motion. They swirled around him like a paper vortex, their corners sharp, their words a silent scream. Then they began to tear themselves apart. Pages ripped from bindings, shreds of paper swirling around the room like a blizzard of confetti, a violent, meaningless act of destruction. Leo, terrified, scrambled to gather the remaining journals, the only things of value he had left. He felt a hand, cold and heavy, press against his back, pushing him forward. He stumbled, catching himself on a heavy oak table. The hand then shoved with an impossible force, sending him flying across the room and crashing into a bookshelf. Books rained down on him, their weight a crushing testament to the spirit's power. It wanted him out, but not in a simple, direct way. It wanted him to suffer. The house itself became an extension of the poltergeist's rage. The floorboards shifted beneath his feet, causing him to trip. The doors would slam shut just as he tried to pass through them. The windows would frost over with a thick layer of ice, trapping him in. He found a journal written by the last owner, a woman named Eleanor. The last few entries were a descent into madness, a terrified chronicle of her own haunting. She wrote of the whispers, the cold spots, and the furniture moving on its own. But the last entry was a desperate plea, written in a shaky hand. It's not a ghost, it's a memory. The house is angry and it remembers what was done. Leo's historical curiosity had turned into a desperate need for survival. He searched the house for clues to the spirit's identity, for the source of its rage. He found a hidden compartment behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Inside, he found a small, rusted music box. When he wound it, a simple, mournful tune began to play, a melody that felt both familiar and deeply sad. The moment the music started, the rage in the house surged. The glass in the windows shattered with a deafening crack. The lights flickered and died. The air grew impossibly thin, and Leo felt as if he were drowning in a sea of cold. The rocking chair from the nursery appeared in the hallway, rocking so violently its legs were splintering. A furious wail, the sound of 1,000 people screaming, echoed through the house. The poltergeist wasn't just angry, it was heartbroken. It was the memory of a betrayed love, a broken promise, a life lost. The music box was a symbol of that loss, a physical tether to its pain. The spirit wasn't a person anymore. It was the concentrated, poisonous essence of its own sorrow and anger, and it would never leave, ever. Leo fled the house, the music box clutched in his trembling hands. He didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned, the wailing of the house still ringing in his ears. He knew he was a survivor, but he was also now a keeper of a terrible secret. He had looked into the heart of a poltergeist and found not a playful spirit, but a well of bottomless, consuming rage. The house on Whisperwind Lane remains empty to this day. Locals say you can still hear the faint sound of a music box on the wind and a low, furious murmur, as if the very walls are whispering a warning. The house remembers, and its anger is eternal. The Whispering Grand stood as a monument to a forgotten age, its towering facade of weathered stone and ornate ironwork a stark contrast to the sleek glass and steel of the city's new skyline. It had once been the jewel of the metropolis, a haven for the wealthy and the powerful. But now, it was little more than a whisper, a relic whispered about in hushed tones by the city's inhabitants. The hotel was old, but its decay was not of time alone. It was the decay of something more sinister, a deep-seated rot that had festered in its bones for decades. I was the night manager, a position few were willing to take. The pay was high, but the hours were long, and the solitude was absolute. Most nights, I was the only soul in the entire building, a fact that was both a comfort and a curse. The Whispering Grand wasn't just quiet, it was silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that was broken only by the groaning of the old building and the incessant ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby. The stories were part of the job. Guests who stayed on the upper floors would sometimes report strange occurrences. The faint scent of lavender and old lace in the hallways, the sound of a woman weeping from an empty room, and the chilling feeling of being watched. I always dismissed them as the ramblings of overtired tourists, a bit of dramatic flair to make their stay more memorable. But then came the incidents in room 413. It started subtly. A guest would check in, only to check out an hour later, pale and shaken. They'd never give a reason, just an urgent need to leave. I'd go up to inspect the room, but I'd find nothing out of the ordinary. The bed would be untouched, the towels pristine. Everything would be exactly as the housekeeping staff had left it. Yet, the feeling of wrongness in that room was palpable, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach that would only dissipate once I closed the door behind me. Then, things escalated. One evening, a couple checked into 413. I warned them, of course, giving them the standard spiel about the old hotel's character. They laughed it off, clearly more interested in the grandeur of the room than the whispers of a tired night manager. At 3 a.m., the fire alarm went off, its shrill wail echoing through the empty halls. I sprinted up the stairs to 413, my heart pounding against my ribs. The door was ajar, and a thick, cloying smoke was pouring out. I pushed it open, ready to grab the fire extinguisher. The smoke was not from a fire. It was a dense, suffocating gray haze that had the stench of burning hair and ozone. In the center of the room, the couple was standing frozen in place, their faces twisted in a rictus of terror. Floating in front of them was a figure, a woman in a tattered antique dress. Her face was a blur of distorted features, but her eyes, two pinpricks of pure, incandescent rage, were unnervingly clear. The woman did not move, but the air around her crackled with a malevolent energy, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I don't remember what I did next, only the feeling of pure, unadulterated fear. The next thing I knew, I was at the front desk, the couple standing beside me, their bodies still trembling. They left without a word, their eyes vacant and hollow. When I went back to 413, the room was pristine. The smoke was gone. The smell was gone. The feeling of wrongness, however, was still there, now more potent than ever. I did my research. The Whispering Grandstood had a dark history, one the current owners had tried to bury. Decades ago, a young woman named Eleanor, a servant girl, had been found dead in what was now room 413. The official report said it was a suicide, but the rumor was she had been wronged by one of the hotel's wealthy guests, a man who had promised her everything and given her nothing but a broken heart and a lifetime of disgrace. Her spirit, it was said, had never left. The next night, I waited. I knew she was angry, and I knew why. She had been betrayed, used, and cast aside, and the hotel, a symbol of the very class that had destroyed her, had become her prison and her weapon. I walked up to room 413, my heart a hammer in my chest. I opened the door, and the cold air rushed out to meet me. The room was empty, yet the scent of lavender and old lace was so strong it made my head spin. "Eleanor," I whispered into the silence. The temperature dropped again, a sudden, chilling plunge. The lights flickered and the air crackled. The image of the woman in the tattered dress shimmered into existence before me, her blurred face a mask of silent fury. "I know," I said, my voice barely a tremor. "I know what he did. It wasn't right." She floated closer, her distorted face mere inches from mine. I could feel the cold of her hatred, a frigid wave that sought to freeze the very blood in my veins. But I didn't back down. "He used you," I said, my voice gaining strength. "He promised you forever and gave you a grave. But this isn't a life. It's a cage. You're trapped here, Eleanor." Her form flickered, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something in her blurred eyes. Not rage, but a deep, profound sorrow. The rage, I realized, was what she had become, not who she was. "He's long gone, Eleanor," I said, my voice softer now. "He can't hurt you anymore. You don't have to hurt anyone else." The air around her seemed to tremble, and a faint, heart-wrenching sob echoed through the room. Her form began to dissipate, and the cold receded. The room grew still, the silence now a gentle, peaceful blanket instead of a suffocating weight. The scent of lavender lingered for a moment longer, a ghostly perfume of what once was. From that night on, the incidents in room 413 stopped. The cold was gone, the smoke was gone, the weeping was gone. The room was just a room again. The Whispering Grandstood was still old, still a relic of a bygone era, but the decay had stopped. It was still silent, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of a long-held breath finally being released, the quiet of a spirit finally finding peace. But I still check room 413 every night. And sometimes when I do, I think I can still feel a faint, cool breeze and catch the faintest whiff of lavender, like a whispered thank you on the wind. The rain lashed against the grimy windows of Blackwood Manor, a sound like 1,000 skeletal fingers tapping for entry. Elias Thorne, a man whose life had been a meticulous ledger of facts and figures, had inherited the house from a distant, eccentric uncle he'd never met. The will, a convoluted mess of archaic legal jargon, stipulated that he must live in the house for 1 full year to claim the substantial trust fund. Elias, a cynic to his core, saw it as a minor inconvenience for a major payout. The house itself was a morbid, sprawling testament to decay. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that penetrated the gloom, and the air was thick with the scent of rot and old memories. He'd hired a team to clean it, but the stains on the floorboards seemed to seep from the wood itself, and the shadows in the corners never quite went away. The first few weeks were uneventful, a monotonous cycle of unpacking and ignoring the creaks and groans of the old house settling. Elias dismissed them as the natural sounds of an aging structure. He even found a certain morbid humor in the exaggerated tales of the locals, who spoke of Blackwood Manor as a place where the living were guests and the dead were the landlords. The first oddity came from the library, a vast circular room lined with shelves of leather-bound books, many of which were crumbling with age. One evening, as he was organizing them, he heard a sound like a page turning, a slow, deliberate swoosh. He glanced up, but the room was empty. He shrugged it off as a draft, but the sound repeated, coming from a different section of the library. It was a phantom reader turning a phantom page. Then came the music. A faint, lilting tune from a forgotten era would drift up the grand staircase. It sounded like a music box, but the melody was mournful, a lullaby woven with threads of sorrow. He followed the sound one night, tracing it to a locked room on the second floor. The door, a heavy oak monstrosity, was cold to the touch. The music stopped the moment his hand brushed the doorknob. But the real horror began with the portraits. Blackwood Manor was filled with them, a gallery of long-dead thorns, their painted eyes following him as he moved. He'd often catch a glimpse of a face in his peripheral vision, a flicker of movement, only to turn and find the portrait as still and lifeless as it should be. One particular portrait of a stern-faced woman in a high-collared dress seemed to hold a special malevolence. Her name, a small plaque revealed, was Isolde Blackwood, the original owner of the house. He often felt a prickle on his neck when he walked past her, a feeling of being watched, judged. One night, a fierce storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil brewing within Elias. The power went out, plunging the house into a suffocating darkness. He lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting long, grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. He was in the sitting room, the familiar sound of the rain his only companion, when a new sound joined the symphony of the storm. A whisper. It was faint at first, a breath of cold air against his ear. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming words he couldn't quite grasp. They were old words, like a forgotten language, filled with a profound sadness. He spun around, holding up his candle. The light fell upon the portrait of Isolde Blackwood. Her painted lips, which had always been a thin, severe line, seemed to be moving. A slow, agonizing smile stretched across her face, a grotesque parody of joy. Her eyes, two dark, emotionless pools, seemed to bore into his very soul. "You are not a thorn," the whispers hissed, now clear and sharp. "You are not family. You are a trespasser." Elias stumbled backward, the candle clattering to the floor, extinguishing with a pathetic sizzle. The room was now pitch black, but he could feel her presence, a cold weight in the air. The sound of her dress rustling against the floorboards was impossibly loud, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. "We welcome our own," the voice whispered, now right beside him. "The others, we keep." He scrambled to his feet, fumbling his way through the darkness, his mind screaming for him to run. He crashed into a heavy chair, its solid presence a momentary comfort. He heard the whisper again, but this time it was a different voice, a child's voice full of a heartbreaking terror. "She won't let us leave. She keeps us all." Elias reached the grand staircase, his hands scraping against the banister. He could hear the laughter now, a dry, hollow cackle echoing from the walls. Not just one voice, but many. The phantom reader, the music box child, the rustling dress. They were all here, a chorus of the tormented, bound to this house. He reached the front door, his fingers fumbling with the heavy bolt. A cold hand, impossibly small and frail, brushed against his. A child's voice, now clear and close, sobbed, "Don't go. She'll be angry." He ripped the bolt free and threw the door open, the wind and rain rushing in like a cleansing force. He stood on the porch, gasping for breath, the fear a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked back at the house, a dark, imposing silhouette against the stormy sky. The window to the library was alight with a soft, ethereal glow. In the center of the room, A woman, transparent and shimmering, sat in a chair, holding a book. She wasn't reading. She was staring directly at him. Her smile, a twisted mockery of warmth, was the last thing Elias Thorne saw before he turned and fled into the storm, leaving the inheritance, the house, and the souls trapped within its walls forever. The legend of Blackwood Manor continued, but now there was a new whisper on the wind, a story of a man who escaped, but who would forever hear the turning of a phantom page and the cold whisper of a ghostly mother who keeps her children close.